Got it. Is the direction we're heading over the next couple of weeks. It's titled Social Psychology, which is a little bit different than what we've been kind of talking about, because it's about the study. What we really have been talking about is the study of the individual mind. Okay, so how the individual mind develops. Yes, we talked about the social emotional interaction with family, but it's all about the individual. That's really what a lot of psychology is about when we look at things like memory, sensations, perceptions, biological psychology. It's really focused on the individual. But where we're going to head over the next couple weeks is into the realm of social psychology, which is the study of the interaction between the individuals and other people, be it groups, be it intimate partners, be it family members, and how that influences both the individual behavior, but how individuals influence the group. Specifically, we'll get into things like stereotypes, we'll get into things like prejudice and discrimination and attitudes. But we'll also have a conversation that looks at intimacy, intimate relationships, human sexuality, and family development. So that's kind of the realms that we're going to hit in this section over the next couple weeks, which I'm hoping we'll start today. And I'm thinking we'll end on that Monday just after Thanksgiving. And then we'll hit our last topic, which is mental health, which we already started a video on last week. And so we'll really be talking about specifically about different mental health conditions, treatment for mental health, and how we should view that. So that's how we'll kind of end the semester after we're done with the topics we have at hand. Okay. But to start, it's always important to kind of start with some definitions and some ideas about the specific field of social psychology and how psychologists approach the study of individuals and their interaction with their social world. So that's kind of where we'll start with today. And we will end a little bit early because I want to make sure you have some time to do the short-term memory quiz and to get that 4 little question quiz out of the way. So we'll just go for a little while here today, and then we'll go from there, okay? So let's look at what social psychology is. All right. When we look at the definition, if you remember this, the definition of psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And so it is, the idea that we study what people do and how people think and feel. Okay. When we look at social psychology, we still are looking at thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So it's a scientific attempt to explain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals as influenced by actual, imagined, or implied presence of other human beings. And I kind of want to explain this. Actual presence is when there's someone actually there. So we'll look at studies of examples such as social persuasion, where how people are persuaded to act one way or the other based on just the mere presence or the actions of other people. Imagined presence is when we are thinking about our social world. It's kind of what we have our attitudes about. I think I've mentioned a couple times in this class that, and when we talked in developmental psychology, about something called the default network, which is the area of the brain that turns on when we're not thinking about thinking, when we're not doing any type of like problem solving. And it's an automatic system. Well, that same default system is the same system that is associated with when we're thinking about our social world, when we're thinking about our relationships, our families, our children. That system automatically turns on every time we're not thinking about something. A couple weeks ago, I talked about memory and attention. And I said in the attention lecture, I stated that most lectures, students get about 10, maybe 15 minutes out of an hour lecture that they actually attend to, even though we feel like we're attending to a complete lecture. Because what happens is about every 10, 15 seconds, or no, more than that, about 20, 25 seconds, excuse me, our brain switches to the default network for a few seconds, 10 or so seconds, because the brain needs to adjust its attention, okay? And so imagined presence is all that activity that we have about thinking about other people. And then we have implied presence of others. And then I think the best way to understand this study is if you've ever been in like a rural place that has a stoplight, and let's say it's 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and there's no traffic anywhere, but you still stop at that stoplight and wait for it to turn green. This is the idea of implied presence of others, because most of the time what's going through an individual's mind is there might be a police officer somewhere that would see me go through that red light. And so that's the example of an implied presence of someone else. Is we think someone is there that is watching us, and therefore we behave in a certain way. And we'll talk about how these different types of presence of others kind of influence our behavior, okay? And from the study of the influence of others and whatnot, we come up with kind of 3 general themes that social psychology has has found in the research that we've done and whatnot. The first theme is that group influences and in group influence and the power of groups. You know, when we look at things like rioting behavior, when we look at things that are called herd behaviors in human beings, this is truly the power of groups and the power that groups have on individual behavior. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about things like rioting behaviors and the presence of others or the presence of other groups, okay? Subjective experience for social psychologists, we really feel like the person matters. The way a social psychologist views behavior is that everyone is kind of like an actor on a stage. We all have our role, we all have our place, and that place is important in that situation. But in order to understand the entire situation, you have to understand the entire stage. You have to understand the co-actors. You have to understand the conductor. You have to understand those people in the back that are setting the stage and the audience. And so that while the individual subjective experience is very important, we also understand that all of that is also influenced by the situation that the person finds them in. The other thing that we find in social psychology is just the smallest manipulation can have large influences on behavior. And we have seen this with the example that I gave during the memory and cognition, when we talked about memory and cognition with the inner city group going to UCLA. And actually, you know what? I did not give that example in this class, so erase that. That was a sociology class. We'll get to how small manipulations can influence behavior. Just the smallest change in an environment can alter a person's behavior. You don't need huge changes in order to change behavior. And I like this quote from Turner in 1982. He says, "We are concerned with group membership as a psychological and not a formal institutional state, with a subjective sense of togetherness, we-ness, or belongingness, which indicates the formation of a psychological group." And the meaning behind this is that we're going to talk about something called social identity theory. And we'll talk about how our identity with our social world is vitally important, okay? We have become to understand in the last several decades with the advent of what's called social neuroscience, that our social world, that human beings are social beings. We cannot survive without each other. Studies in World War II that were conducted unethically showed that when you isolate a person completely from any type of human contact, including smell, hearing, and sight, but you provide that individual with all the worldly comforts they need: food, water, warmth, and comfort. Okay, even though you provide them with those worldly comforts, without any type of social contact of any type, the individual will start going through a starvation process. They will basically die as if they were dying of starvation or dying of thirst. Okay, so we know other human beings are vitally important to human existence. We literally will physically and biologically die without having connection with other people. On the neuroscience end, I talked about the default network already, but the interesting part is we've talked about how the prefrontal cortex is our logic area. It's a logical area of the brain. It's our higher thinking ability. It's our ability to solve math problems and the like. But the interesting thing that we have found in neuroscience, which I think is fascinating, is if we take that frontal cortex that is actually responsible for human higher thinking and we flatten it out into an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, okay, the area that is actually dedicated to math problems, logic problems, engineering problems would be the size of a quarter on that piece of paper. The rest of the piece of paper would be concerned with navigating our social world, with understanding the behaviors of other people, with our identity. So even this frontal area that we think is the part of the brain that makes humans human is a social area, largely, except for one small quarter area of it, okay? And so we can't live without each other, and our brain drives us to interact with each other. The other thing about social psychology that is a little bit different than the rest of psychologies is when we look at the other psychologies, we take what's called a dispositional approach, meaning that a person who has psychological problems is because of brain mechanism. It's because of them. It's because of something they've gone through. It's their issue. It's a disposition. It's kind of like a disease model that once you have cancer, it was caused by your body's biology, and there's no other different explanation. Well, social psychologists don't deny that there's biological issues and the like, but we've realized that the situation a person finds them in has far significant more impact on their behavior than does individual experience. And I'll give an example, and this brings up not only situationalism, but it also brings up things that we think are really about the individual, but can be found in the situation. I'm gonna see if I can let me get out of here really quick because I wanna, want to draw this out kind of the best I can. So I'm going to put a new slide in here. Okay. So I want to explain a situation about what's called stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is when we feel we're in a situation where we're being stereotyped. We tend to act according to that stereotype, okay? And so a good example of stereotype threat is a series of research that was done at UCLA and Stanford University. And what they did, and I'm going to put a little chart here. Sorry about my lines. And L means low, H means high. Is traditionally when we measure things such as intelligence and cognitive ability to think and problem solve, we know that we've seen or we've observed that Black inner city kids tend to score much less than white kids, whether they're inner city or not, okay? And this has been observed over and over and over in research. But some social psychologists really wanted to really take a look at this and see if it's about the stereotype that they're in or if it's truly about their cognitive ability. And so what they did, and they chose a Saturday to do this on, they did it on 2 different Saturdays. This is just an example of what they did. This is kind of the simplified version of what they did. Well, I should say the first thing they did is they gave their students at UCLA, mostly white, and Stanford, a cognitive test. And this is a cognitive solving test. It's very similar to what you would do with an IQ test. It uses analogies to determine level of cognitive ability. And so this is our control group, okay? And of course, they scored pretty high. You know, you have to have good cognitive ability to make it to those, quote unquote Ivy League or those types of universities. So they did really well. But they had 2 Saturdays, 1, 2. And what they did is they had some inner city Black students from a community college come to Stanford or UCLA on 2 separate Saturdays, and this was replicated. That's why I'm mentioning both. And they picked Saturday, and they picked a Pacific building to do these tests in, because they no one is around at that time, so it can be the situation can be manipulated. Okay. On one Saturday, they had sitting outside of the building and kind of in the hallways, making no actual eye contact, no kind of social contact. They just had some white, what we call Confederates, students who are working for the researchers, and they were just present. Okay, so we have one situation in which white individuals are present. And then in the other Saturdays that they did this, there was nobody around. The only person that was around was a person who was administering the cognitive test, who was also a Black professor. But that was the only person that was around, okay? And it was really, really interesting, the results. I think they're fascinating. Is on the Saturday when there was white kids around, when there were other white students around, which we'll call condition 1, the students measured according to the stereotype, what was predicted, okay? The interesting thing was on the second Saturday, when the only person that was around was that Black professor that was the same race and everything as them. Because, and I found this research fascinating because it's so interesting, because they actually scored the same on this cognitive test as the UCLA and Stanford students did. Exactly the same. But the only difference between this Saturday and this Saturday is that on that first Saturday, and these are different students, so that wasn't students who were familiar with the test, is on that first Saturday, there was just the mere presence of another race there. And this is where those students scored. But when there was no, what we call stereotype threat, when there was no presence, it was just them, they were there, they scored just as well as the other Stanford and UCLA students, okay? And again, this was a selected group of people. These were inner city kids, so they were not minority Blacks who had any type of advantages or the like. But this is the results. And so going back to this example, this is why social psychologists say the situation matters. It even matters on measures of intelligence. And this is also why when I go back to here, we say small manipulations happen. On that second Saturday, on that first Saturday, there was just the presence of a threat, a stereotype threat. There was no other thing between that first Saturday and that second Saturday other than the presence of another group, okay? And again, this also goes to point one about the influence of group and the power of groups and how groups can influence even other groups, okay? So social psychologists have taken on the notion of situationalism, and we're going to talk about the Stanford prison studies. We're going to talk about the Milgram's shock experiments, and we will see that just the influence of others can have big impacts on our behavior, and we'll get into that, okay? And just to kind of state, why do we talk about the situation so much, is that ordinary people overemphasize personality and personality's influence on performance. And we often underemphasize the situation and what it brings out in an individual. And we also know that the complexity of personality judgments requires a whole different subset of field, which we'll get to, okay? And that most of them are very incomplete. But the thing we can very solidly say is this is how the situation influences one's behavior, okay? And some example of that is, I'm trying to think of these. We'll get to these in just, we'll get to these examples here in just a couple minutes of why we tend to underestimate the situation and overemphasize personality. We'll get to those in just a minute. Okay. For any of those who actually, let me see. For any of those who attended that lecture that I did on the real monsters of the world, which really focused on psychopathology and stuff, but I mentioned at the beginning when we talked about just homicide, about how our current explanations of why people commit crimes, why people act evil, are really incomplete. Because what we have found is that individuals will act in an evil way just based upon the situation that they find themselves in. And we found that, you know, there's three basic things: social identity threat, that's a threat to who we are; influence of groups and authority figures and individuals with perceived power can influence how we act; and dynamics within the context of the social situation far out predict why people act the way they do than are they cognitive, do they have cognitive disabilities? Are they delayed in some way? Are they missing some empathetic part of their system? These actually explain people's behaviors much more better than those explanations. And then, so that's just another situation of what we're going to talk about. I'm actually going to, I'm going to go ahead and actually stop here because I feel like this can be a full lecture this coming Monday when we get into social interactions. And I don't want to confuse anybody. So this is what I would like to do for the rest of the day. So we did a quick introduction to